The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
The Privileges Committee says he lied on oath, having already lied to the Commons about lockdown Partygate. There are 104 references to misleading in the report, and the committee says Boris Johnson did it deliberately.
There was no party. All guidance was followed and the rules were followed. That is what I have been repeatedly assured.
The Tory-dominated committee says his claims to the Commons that COVID rules weren't broken with Downing Street parties and that he'd received repeated assurances about that were lies. The committee ruled that Boris Johnson lied knowingly to the House of Commons on at least 8 occasions. He then lied in his actual evidence to the Privileges Committee. They calculate on 6 areas of evidence. He compounded his sins in another contempt to the committee when he breached confidence, went public with a confidential draft. And they feel he was complicit in a campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of committee members. The committee said if he hadn't resigned, they would have slapped a 90-day suspension on him. They also said he should not be given the ex-MP's parliamentary access pass.
Is this the end, Mr. Johnson?
The only sighting of Boris Johnson today, but his office released a written statement with a barrage of invective aimed at the committee that had judged him. They were talking out the back of their necks. It was, he said, the final knife thrust in a protracted political assassination.
I find this spiteful, I find this vindictive and massively overreaching. I don't think any reasonable member of the public can read that and say that this is fair and just.
Thank you all. Thank you.
In some Tory associations, support for Boris Johnson remains strong, and some say they'll put pressure on their Tory MPs to vote against the Privileges Committee report on Monday.
We are in talks with many in fact associations in the Yorkshire region, and a majority of the members are Boris supporting associations. So within the party we are going to see potential deselections, especially for MPs who could vote for this privileges report.
Hello, open the door right now, otherwise we're going to break it.
Rishi Sunak joined immigration enforcement on a dawn raid this morning. Number 10 has not confirmed what he'll do in Monday's vote.
I think Rishi Sunak has got to lean into this. I think he's got to fully accept the recommendations of the committee. I think it's very important that he walks through the lobbies in support of the committee on Monday. He's got to make it very clear that there is no question of Boris Johnson standing as a Conservative candidate under his leadership.
I wouldn't block him because that will lead to, I think, very dangerous consequences for the party. It could actually be a bloodbath. They could actually split the party, and no one wants to see that, or certainly we don't want to see that.
The man who backed Boris Johnson for the leadership 4 years ago must now decide, after a coruscating report, how hard he should be on the former Prime Minister. He doesn't like picking fights, does he? But you think he's going to have to?
Well, he's going to have to pick a fight on this, because this is really about the soul of the Conservative Party. If Johnsonism, if I can describe what comes out in that report, is the future of the Conservative Party has no future.
Divided parties don't win elections, so I hope we now have a watershed moment where we can actually come together after this has been concluded.
Doesn't look like that, does it?
Well, I think there's some words that need to be said first, and this will start obviously today after looking at the report, but when I'm in there on Monday, I'm certainly going to be saying what I think.
A vocal but declining section of the party would like Boris Johnson back. One former cabinet minister Boris Johnson threw out of the Conservative Party thinks he should now be disinvited from major ceremonial, written out of the national script.
I don't think he should be treated as a former Prime Minister in the way that all the other living former Prime Ministers are treated.
So state occasions, maybe even the cenotaph?
I think there's got to be a question mark about that. Let's not be in any doubt about this. Boris Johnson is in disgrace.
The committee released new evidence from a number 10 official who said throughout the pandemic, Wine Time Friday sessions in Downing Street, birthday parties, leaving parties continued as normal. The official wrote that number 10, through COVID, was an oasis of normality.
Thank you and goodbye. Thank you.
Tonight, Boris Johnson is again setting the mood in the building he left 9 months ago, as Rishi Sunak ponders how far he should go in joining in the condemnations of the Privileges report.
Well, earlier I spoke to the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was knighted in Boris Johnson's resignation honours list. I began by asking him whether he felt the former Prime Minister had been completely demolished by his own colleagues.
Well, I think there's a real problem with the committee because Harriet Harman ought never to have chaired it. Bear in mind the chairman provides the draft, is a key influential figure, and yet she had tweeted her views before she was appointed to the committee. And if you look at the Hoffman principle for another parliamentary committee, that case the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords, the House of Lords decided that because his wife was a member of Amnesty, there was the risk of the appearance of partiality, and therefore the judgment was set aside. I think the same applies in this case. She should not have chaired it, and her influence on it affects the whole validity of the report.
But you could have said all of this all the way along. The fact is that now the committee has come up with such a damning sheet of evidence, endorsed, I might say, unanimously by all four Tories on the committee. This is not just Harriet Harman's judgment, this is a judgment cross-party.
I said this as soon as I discovered the tweets had been issued. And there is an issue with the most senior Tory, isn't there?
Right.
Who it now turns out has not denied being at one of his own parties, a party for his wife's 65th birthday.
But he hasn't misled the House.
No, but he sits in judgment. You can't sit in judgment for the same offence, really, of which you've now found that you're involved.
But do you accept that what is at stake here is misleading the House? It's honesty, it's integrity, it's the supremacy of parliamentary democracy. And in that context, whether Sir Bernard attended a lockdown gathering is not as crucial
it's really
as whether he misled the House.
It's really important because it comes to the credibility of the report. And the report loses credibility on two grounds. One is on the ground of Harriet Harman, who should have recused herself, and the second is Bernard needs to come out and say this is not true to re-establish his credibility. Because if he was attending a party for his wife's 65th birthday...
He said he hasn't attended parties. He didn't attend any lockdown parties, he said.
Yes, but he then didn't deny that he was at this particular event.
But is it not pretty ropey, actually worse than ropey? It's dangerous, isn't it, that you and your allies and Boris Johnson are dismissing a forensic 108-page report as, and I quote, a charade, tripe, they're a kangaroo court, they're deranged. This isn't a Trumpian attempt to undermine parliamentary democracy, isn't it?
Simply not, no. Just because it's a long report doesn't make it a good report. That is the sort of very straightforward view of any document.
But is it tripe? Is it rubbish? Is it deranged?
Well, let me answer your question. But the issue here is, do we have freedom of speech? How does our parliamentary system work? It works on an adversarial system. One member stands up, the next member stands up and says this is wrong, this is not right. You are absolutely free in our democratic system to criticise politicians, to criticise the systems they used, to criticise the reports they produce. If you were to say that everything the House of Commons did was perfect, you would have to say it was contempt of Parliament to dislike the Dangerous Dogs Act, which would be absurd.
OK, but you like to talk about parliamentary sovereignty. You've staked your career on parliamentary sovereignty, and yet now something comes out of Parliament that you don't like, and most people condemned in that way would accept the judgment and go and serve their time or whatever needs to happen.
I'm fully supportive of parliamentary sovereignty. I believe an Act of Parliament is the highest law in the land. I haven't questioned the right of Parliament to issue this report. I merely said this is a bad report. The two things are different concepts.
The committee's accused its critics of attempted intimidation. Have allies of Boris Johnson attempted to smear members of the committee by putting about stories about their conduct, their personal life?
Not that I'm aware of.
Would you condemn that if it had happened?
You are absolutely entitled, as I have done, to criticise the committee and to criticise the chairman for chairing the committee and having a position that to my mind was entirely improper when she had expressed her views beforehand. But intimidation is always wrong.
Mm-hmm. So smearing members of the committee, spreading personal stories and rumours, you condemn that?
Well, smearing people is a bad thing to do. I'm not in favour of smearing people. This doesn't mean that if Bernard Jenkins was at a party, that isn't a relevant factor. That's not a smear. If that is true, and he hasn't denied the specific question, if that is true, that is a relevant factor.
How much support do you think Boris Johnson has in that place now?
Well, I think in the country at large, he maintains considerable support. He is still, why are we talking about this? Because he is still the biggest political figure in our country. In the House of Commons, his support within the Conservative Party is less than it was, but he never had more than about half the support of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, even when he won the leadership back in 2019.
Do you think he's finished politically?
Oh no, I think oddly this has helped him. They've gone too far. They have found against him on some things that are completely unreasonable. That the stuff about when he walked to the flat, he must have known. Unless you're in somebody's mind, you can't say what people must have known. This is pure speculation. 90 days is a vindictive level of penalty, even though he's left, so it becomes irrelevant. But they've over-egged their particular pudding and made themselves look vindictive and actually therefore help Boris Johnson. It's reinvigorated his supporters.
And if he does make a comeback, would it be at the helm of the Conservative Party or a new party that he might set up?
Well, he wouldn't have my support if he set up a new party. I'm a die-hard Tory, come what may. I hope so. I'm pretty sure he is. So I think he'll come back within the Conservative Party.
Nadine Dorries, your colleague, also an ally of Boris Johnson, says that Conservative MPs who vote for that report are fundamentally not Conservative and they're risking deselection. Do you agree with her?
That is not how I would phrase myself.
Do you regret that she phrased herself in that way?
I wouldn't dream of telling Nadine how to phrase herself, but I would not ever say anything about how people vote in the House of Commons.
Nadine Dorries has also said in the last few days that her peerage was removed by, and I quote, 2 privileged posh boys who went to Winchester and Oxford. Do you think you got a knighthood because you're a privileged posh boy who went to Eton and Oxford?
No, I don't. I don't think my education had anything to do with it. But you have to recognise that political honours are part of a patronage system. They are part of the system that oils our political mechanism.
And you understood that and she didn't?
No, she understood that and she deserved her peerage, which Boris Johnson tried to give her.
Do you think twice about accepting a knighthood from someone who has been so fundamentally dismantled by this report?
Well, the report hadn't come out, so I hadn't seen this.
Oh, you could always hand it back.
No, you can't. Well, that would be very rude to His Majesty. I wouldn't dream of doing such a thing.
And you don't feel at all grubby accepting a knighthood from Boris Johnson?
No, not at all. I don't think there's anything in that line of argument, actually. I'm not in the position of somebody who has done 40 years community work and has been given an honour, who do something absolutely exceptional. I have received an honour for political service, which is part of the way this country is run.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now is Labour MP Thangam Debonair, the shadow leader of the House of Commons. Thangam Debonair, Jacob Rees-Mogg said there that the committee over-egged the pudding and actually made a Boris Johnson come back more rather than less likely.
Well, I think that's quite extraordinary. I think the people up and down the country who are worrying about their mortgages or their rent or the cost of their food bill, they've got things to really worry about that they must be despairing at the moment that the Prime Minister is being so very distracted. Now, if Boris Johnson really thinks that more Tory psychodrama is good for the country, I'd be very surprised if the voters would agree with him. Well, and which seat is going to select him?
Right. Well, the Prime Minister is barely distracted by this report because he's trying to ignore it as much as possible. But do you think the report should have gone further then, that Boris Johnson should have been expelled completely?
Well, I wasn't on the committee and we voted just about a year ago to delegate our responsibility for this inquiry to this committee. They are very experienced. It's a cross-party with a Tory majority and I will be voting to endorse, approve the findings of the report and the recommendations on Monday because that's what we delegated them to do.
So the Labour member voted to expel him. Presumably you agree with her?
With the report, as I've read it, it was a unanimous decision. The recommendations they made and the sanction that they applied of 90 days plus the recommendation for him not to have a pass, an ex-member's pass. That, as I understand it from reading the report, that is a unanimous decision by the committee.
So expelling him would have been vindictive, would it?
Expelling him isn't what's in the report. The report says very, very clearly 90 days plus removal of his former MP's pass.
Was Harriet Harman's tweet last April suggesting that Boris Johnson had misled Parliament? That was unfortunate at best, prejudicial at worst, wasn't it?
Anybody reading the report can see the evidence that the committee looked at. They can see it in detail, they can see how well the committee assessed it, and if they disagree with it, they are free to come to Parliament on Monday and vote against the report. But I urge every member to read the report carefully. As it happens, this committee voted unanimously. The chair does not have a vote unless there is a tie,
which was not the case. Would you rather she hadn't tweeted that? Would it have made, it would have made her white and white?
I actually think it would have been quite difficult to find any MP on any side who hadn't at some point criticised Boris Johnson. Harriet Harman is an experienced lawyer. She is the mother of the House. She's been the chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights.
It doesn't make her Mother Teresa,
and she was unanimously voted by the House of Commons to chair this committee. Boris Johnson didn't vote against her. Nobody voted against her being the chair.
OK, Bernard Jenkin attended a lockdown gathering, reportedly.
We don't know
Is that a problem? Well, the event took place. He doesn't describe it as a party. There's a bit of a quibble about that. It's unfortunate as well, isn't it?
I think we have to judge the committee's report on how well they assess the evidence, and that's what I'm trying to do. If there's a separate question, that will take place with a separate process. At the moment, I think the most we need to do is in relation to Boris Johnson, is to read the report carefully, assess how the committee has come to their conclusion. We can all look at the evidence. That's the most important thing we can do in relation to this case.
Of course, it suits you to carry on talking about all of this because you're finding Rishi Sunak a much tougher nut to crack than Boris Johnson was. So you want him back in the headlines,
Rishi
don't you?
Sunak is so weak that he couldn't stand up to Boris Johnson and do something about the honours list that has so debased the honours system. On Friday, Rishi Sunak could have said, hang on a minute, the privileges report isn't out yet. And he could have said, we'll wait at least until after the report. And instead, he just waved it through. That's
if he's so weak, why are the polls narrowing now then?
He is so weak that he can't stand up to Boris Johnson. I think it's polls come and go. We will be fighting until the very end for every single vote. And the general election, as you say, Kathy, is the one that matters.
Sangham Debonair, thanks very much.